evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's event with Kevin Vallier and Nolan McCarty. I'm Janie Herman, the Public Programming Librarian here at Princeton Public Library, and I'll be your host for the evening. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping items so that we can have a smooth event. The first thing is, if you're having any issues at all with the sound or audio, you can get audio-video help right below where it says live. In the bottom left-hand corner, it's a little gray link down there. Usually if you're having any troubles, you can go there and that will actually help you walk through the steps to fix it. Second of all, you can see that right in the middle there's a button. It says Purchase Trust in a Polarized Age. That will take you to the publisher's website if you would like to buy a copy of this book after listening to this event, and we hope you will. We are currently, the chat is open, but I will close the chat during the main event and open it back up at the end. But we are going to be encouraging questions. We have two great scholars on here with us tonight to talk about an important topic. So we urge you to ask questions, and at the bottom of the screen, there is an Ask a Question function. Just drop your questions in there, and I'll come back on at the end to moderate. In the Ask a Question function, you can also upvote any questions that you think are especially important, so you can see what other people are wanting to ask and help us to determine which questions to ask. So I think that is all of our housekeeping, allowing people to just get logged on here so that we can have maximum people when we start the important discussion. So it is more than apparent that Americans today don't trust each other and their institutions as much as they once did. But what steps can we be taking to rebuild this trust? In Trust in a Polarized Age, which was recently published by Oxford University Press, political philosopher Kevin Vallier offers a powerful counter-narrative to the prevailing sense of hopelessness that dogs the American political landscape. And he is here tonight to talk about this book with Nolan McCarty. More about our speakers. Kevin Vallier is an associate professor of philosophy at Bowling Green University, where he directs the program in philosophy, politics, economics, and law. He is the author of 3 monographs, 4 edited volumes, and over 40 peer-reviewed book chapters, and journal articles. His books include Liberal Politics and Public Faith, Beyond Separation, and Must Politics Be War? Restoring Our Trust in the Open Society, which was also published by Oxford University Press. Nolan McCarty is very well known around Princeton. He is the Susan Dodd Brown Professor of Politics and Public Affairs at Princeton University. He is the author and co-author of several previous books, including Polarized America, Political Bubbles, and Polarization, What Everyone Needs to Know. And so you can indeed imagine why he would be the perfect person for us to invite on to talk tonight to Kevin Vallier. So first I'll be bringing Kevin Vallier online. Hi, Kevin, and welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Welcome Nolan to the event. And welcome, guys. I'm going to let you take it away, and I'm going to just kind of disappear. I'll be here online if you need me.
Great, thank you. Welcome, everyone. It's really my pleasure tonight to talk to Kevin about his new book, Trust in a Polarized Age. If anyone doubts that we're in fact living in a polarized age, I only need to draw on a few nuggets from the recent news. First, 50% of Republican voters think the recent election was rigged, according to public opinion polls. Thinking about COVID, turns out that the best predictor of a state's public health response to COVID is the party of the governor. And the best indicator whether an individual wears a mask is whether or not he or she voted for Donald Trump in 2016 or 2020. Unless you think that this does not have profound impacts on the way our political system works, I would then note that despite mounting evidence of a major increase in economic hardship and hunger associated with COVID, Congress has been unable to pass a second relief package to take the place of the first one, which is soon to expire. So polarization is a significant feature both of the public and of our public officials and how they perform their duties in office. Social scientists have studied polarization in the United States for some time. Along the way, we've uncovered a few factors which seem to be the cause of polarization. We'll probably discuss some of those tonight. And a slightly longer list of things that exacerbate it, but probably didn't cause it. But there are precious few solutions to the problem of polarization which has withstood academic scrutiny. But in his new book, Kevin offers a novel set of arguments about the causes and origins of polarization, as well as some provocative suggestions for best how to deal with it. Specifically, he argues that declining social and political trust are to blame. Moreover, he suggests that distrust and political conflict form an insidious feedback loop, which makes either difficult to address on their own. But as a solution, he offers a radically non-radical plan. The idea is to take steps toward reinvigorating small L liberal democratic values, such as the freedom of association, private property, the welfare state, and constitutionalism. So to get things started, Kevin, I think most people have a strong sense that American politics has in fact become more polarized, but are probably unaware of the trends related to social trust and trust in government. What are the patterns of trust in these areas, and why do you think they're related to our polarized politics?
Well, thanks, Nolan, and thanks to Janie and everyone for having me. It's really great to have Nolan here because if you buy the book, I talk a lot about Nolan's work in the introduction, which kind of made what I did possible to think more clearly about. So let me just begin by talking to you a little bit about what the concepts of social and political trust are. So social trust, as it's typically measured, is trust in most people in your society or country. So it's not trust in political or particular institutions. So when I think about social trust, I think that it's when we rely on most other people to follow certain basic social rules that we all think ought to be followed. So a common example are just the rules of the road when you drive. You know, you don't know who you're interacting with when you drive, but you count on them for you to get where you're going. Social trust also doesn't require any particular common or shared goals to count as trust, right? Just like how on the road we go from I'm going one place, you're going another, but we have common rules that, you know, facilitate our ability to get along. Now, some of those rules are what we call conventions in the sense that you just follow them because it's rational for you to do so, like driving on the right-hand side of the road. But there's a lot of the rules of politeness and appropriateness, like allowing people to merge into oncoming traffic in a safe way, that we really do depend on one another to follow. And there are cases like this of different norms that we count each other on that are associated with trust. For instance, like the likelihood that someone will return a wallet if you were to leave it somewhere. Social trust is typically measured, sometimes it's measured in the lab in game theory experiments, but for the most part, it's measured by survey instruments that have been taken all over the world for a few decades. And I'll talk to you a little bit about US social trust here in a moment. But here's why it matters. So social scientists have also been studying social trust for a long time, and they found that it has a variety of correlates. And it's often thought, and I'm convinced by the people who argue, that social trust tends to be a cause rather than an effect. In fact, its origins are somewhat mysterious, and I think will be for some time. So a couple of the different things that look like social trust helps with. It helps with economic growth. People can exchange more when they trust each other more. It helps with economic equality, very likely. It looks like people have a higher preference for redistribution when they trust those who they think will receive it. Social trust does look like it helps people under certain conditions trust the government more, which enables the government to do a lot more things. It can help reduce corruption in the legal system. So all kinds of things you may want from society, all the kind of things that you may be hoping for. We really need social trust in order to know how to do. Now, political trust, as I understand, is trust in government or trust in parts of government to do particular things, particularly to sort of live up to their particular institutional goal, like the EPA, right? What do you trust it to do? You trust it to protect the environment, right? So political trust can be trust in the government as a whole. It can be trust, say, in Congress or trust in the presidency. It can also be trust in, say, the CDC, which is something we've been thinking a whole lot about. And with political trust, I think it matters a great deal to have it just so government can perform basic functions. And I think during COVID, the fact that, you know, certain parts of the government are distrusted and have come to be distrusted as they've been attacked, I think we understand how vital trust in government can be, even if, you know, government is oftentimes something that's dangerous to people. It can also perform some really important functions. Now, let me point out a few trends, if you don't mind me, because they're quite striking. So one of the things that I did the other day was I put together all the different survey instruments that are used to measure social trust. And they asked the same battery of questions, or at least one or more of the same questions, and just averaged them all together where they were overlapping. And what we can see here is that in around 1964, over half of people said that most people could be trusted. Whereas today, the most recent measure in 2018 was at about 32%. Now, if you've looked at the social trust data, one thing that stands out is actually how stable it is internationally. And big movements are unusual, but they're most common when there's some sort of big institutional change. One of the most surprising ones is that when countries transition from dictatorship to democracy, social trust can fall very, very fast. So it's happened in Romania, Spain, Poland, and Chile, for instance. And you may say, well, democracy is good. Why would trust go down? And there's a couple of different hypotheses about that I can talk about. Some of it may just be people more likely to tell the truth to pollsters. It might be that elections give more people to blame for bad policy outcomes. It might be, and this is the most common explanation, that their expectations for democracy get high and then they're disappointed. But the United States is an outlier in a specific sense, because it seems to be the only major country, in fact, the only country I can find, whose social trust has gone down significantly. 23 points is highly significant, without major institutional shifts, like from one fundamental kind of government to another. And so, given what I pointed out, our lower ability to trust most people is problematic. Another thing that's important about trust, if you look at this Pew poll from 2018, is that when they break down social trust levels by age, there are stark generational differences. So you go down to the bottom here to most people can't be trusted. Notice that can't there. People from over 65, about 30% say most people can't be trusted, which is pretty sad. But 18 to 29-year-olds, 60% say that most people can't be trusted, which is, really bad. Now you might think, well, they'll get more trusting as they age. But there's some recent work on Swedish immigrants which suggests that when you're over 30 and you migrate to another country, your social trust levels don't change very much. But if you're younger, they'll move a little bit in the direction of the social trust levels in the countries where they end up. So if social trust attitudes are subject to impressionable ages, it looks like we're seeing declining trust as a kind of cohort effect, and that we can expect for social trust to remain low. Okay, so I've given you a sense of social trust, but here's public trust in the government from 1958. It's been asked a lot longer, to about 2015, but the numbers remained low. There's been a fall of about 50 points, people who trust the government in Washington. You can see an uptick in particular around 9/11. That's not unusual. There's a rally around the flag effect in times of crisis, well, except for during COVID, which has been disappointing. So public trust in government has fallen. It's much more common to see big shifts in political trust because they're oftentimes responses to particular events, where social trust, again, is much more stable. But we've had these really big declines. Okay, so what does all this have to do with polarization? Well, Nolan taught me in his book, Polarization, What Everyone Needs to Know, to distinguish between what I would say are kind of four, at least conceptually distinct phenomena. First, there's issue-based polarization, where, and here I'm gonna screen. So the issue-based polarization, where people come to disagree more about particular issues. There's also affect-based polarization, where people come to dislike each other more. And there's disagreement about, for instance, my understanding is that issue-based polarization and affect-based polarization are more common among elites than most people. So people will say, oh, well, are most people polarized? And it really depends on which people you're talking about. But there's really extreme polarization at the top. There's also sorting. And sorting doesn't require you to change a position, but you kind of move to like-minded groups, either groups where you disagree on issues or groups where you kind of think of them as your in-crowd. There are a lot of really interesting potential relationships between the things that are correlated with political polarization and those that are correlated with social trust. The most interesting connection is income inequality. Most trust researchers think that increases in economic inequality decrease social trust, along the lines of thinking something like that. people see the system isn't working in their favor or something along those lines. And there's different ways in which inequality is thought to affect polarization, or polarization can affect inequality. So, for instance, I think, Nolan, one of the things you suggest is that, as there's more polarization, there's more gridlock, and that can lead to less redistribution, and then that can lead to higher inequality. Now, I'm one of those who thinks that most of the causal direction is from social trust to inequality. So the reason for this is that it looks like people have a higher preference for redistribution, when they trust each other more. So there's a sense that the people receiving the transfers in the United States, they're different than us, right? And we think, okay, well, they're going to waste it, right? They're going to waste it on booze and alcohol. In Sweden, that's just a less common sentiment. There's one possible story where, say, declining social trust increases inequality, which can also have an effect on polarization, or maybe social trust could affect polarization directly. So one way, there's been some very recent studies, one suggests that higher trusters are more likely to have moderate preferences. And one reason that this might be the case is because when you trust people, you listen to them more. And as people are listening to each other, they may be more likely to congregate in the center. So there's a number of different connections that between social trust and polarization, where lower trust makes polarization worse. But polarization, I think, can also make social trust worse, particularly with sorting, right? So the idea is people spend less time together, they interact less, they come to have more false beliefs about the other. There's a lot of different potential connections, and we just need more research to start to tease them apart. But if indeed there is a doom loop between trust in institutions, social trust, and polarization, then we've got a real problem, because it's hard to disentangle those things. So we need to know more about what's going on. So anyway, I thought that will introduce you to a number of the key concepts: social trust, political trust, polarization. I'll keep my answers shorter after this.
Great, thanks. Just to kind of follow up on that point, as you mentioned, economic inequality, as well as, I would say, increasing ethnic and racial diversity, are very strong correlates of increases in political polarization
and social trust.
And so if you're correct in saying that the way to get around polarization is to increase social and political trust, one has to do that in an environment that's highly unequal, both in economic terms and social terms. So how do you think about tackling that very difficult problem of building trust in unequal, diverse societies?
You have to be able to sell, in particular, narrowing inequality in a way that appeals to multiple perspectives. So one of the ideas I focus on in the book is talking about how we want to maintain trust in ways that can be justified to multiple perspectives, what we call publicly justified in some of the philosophical literature on this. So what are policies that look like they can be justified to different political ideologies? People on the left tend, when they make their trust in government judgments, they tend to care a little bit more about inequality than people on the right do. So people are after different things when they're trusting government. They're somewhat different values. One thing that I think people might not think of, but I think could have a lot of an effect, is housing reform. Basically, make it easier to build homes, particularly in cities. Where, in particular, a few cities that are incredibly economically productive, like Los Angeles, San Francisco, and New York City, where it's extremely expensive to build new housing. Now, what's going on here? What does this have to do with trust or polarization? Well, for one thing, these restrictions on real estate probably were a very big part of the increase in economic inequality in the country. So I think it's Matthew Rognley, who, when he was a graduate student at MIT, made the argument that a lot of the inequality findings that you saw in, say, Piketty's work in the United States were due to increases in real estate value inequality, not differences in income. And so how do we reduce real estate value inequality? Well, we let more poor people live in cities. That may hurt the real estate values of very wealthy people, but it's a kind of redistribution that's unlikely to set off warning bells on the right. Right, because it's not a raise in taxes. In fact, it's a way of hurting rich liberals, so they might even approve of it. So you can narrow inequality, but here's another great thing: you can increase economic growth because more workers developing the division of labor more broadly and increasing productivity in those particular areas. So if you increase economic growth, then you can ensure it's relatively broad-based. That can help you more on the right, whereas more economic equality can help you more on the left. There aren't a lot of other good examples of this, but this is one that I think could really do a lot of good. It'd take a while, but it would really do a lot of good. The other is intellectual property reform. I think a lot of the inequalities that we have are due to us having a whole host of intellectual property restrictions that seem unreasonably long, but that allow particularly folks in Silicon Valley to get very wealthy. And so that's another way you could tackle, say, inequality in a way that Republicans may not mind as much. So you have to be careful. You have to be creative in trying to think about how to have policies that are justified to multiple perspectives. That's really the heuristic that I try to use in figuring out what to do. With respect to corruption and social trust, I want to say something here. One of the few things we know we're very confident has a causal impact on social trust is different kinds of observed corruption in government or in the legal system. And a really good way to address this would be, and this won't happen unless the Democrats win the Georgia runoffs, but the For the People Act that was passed by the House last year. It contains a number of really interesting provisions, like automatic voter registration, which is one reason the Republicans won't probably allow it to be voted on. But it does contain in Title VIII some really interesting things that would have prevented Trump from even becoming president indirectly, because it requires divestment of your investments when you become president, and I think it also requires releasing your tax returns for the president, the vice president, and other top officials. So these are ways of addressing corruption where it's very present and clear at the top. And one thing we've seen from the World Values Survey is people may be picking up on this. In 2011, when they did the survey, around 15% of people said most can't be trusted. I just looked at the new World Values Survey, Wave 7, and now about 28% people say that the government in Washington, sorry, I should back up. Around 14% of people in 2011 said the government can't be trusted at all. Whereas in 2017, about 28% said the government can't be trusted at all. A doubling, which is, if anyone you want to look up, you can just go to their database, but it was stunning to me. So we would need things that rein in public corruption, and I think that's what people are responding to, is they're seeing a remarkably publicly corrupt administration and just thinking, look, we can't even rein in corruption in our basic institutions. We have a publicly corrupt president. What does that say about who we are? So you want to address corruption effects as well, and there's some legislation there. And if the Democrats win the runoffs, I think it would probably pass. So that's not like totally out of the bounds of its feasibility.
Sure. As I mentioned in the intro, your primary argument is that one way of tackling trust in a very kind of general way is by reinvigorating several liberal values and institutions like freedom of association, property and economic rights in the welfare state. I suspect that many of our listeners will find the emphasis on property rights and markets to be, fairly surprising. Perhaps you could say a little bit about why you think that economic freedoms are an important part of enhancing trust and perhaps reducing polarization.
Well, so one thing I'd like to do is to distinguish between having markets and tax rates, because a lot of people think, oh, well, you're for markets, and so that means you're for low taxes, because they've just gone together in our politics. But Sweden actually has very well protected, legally speaking, low corruption, open markets, but has a very high amount of redistribution. It's not a socialist society. It's not a capitalist society. It's a capitalist welfare state is what I would say. I work with a Swedish economist sometimes who says, well, in Sweden, we redistribute from the top 90% to the bottom 90%. So what they do is they tax a lot, and they have a more aggressive tax system than we do, but they provide a huge range of services. But they still have very free markets. They have very free trade, and I think still have lower corporate tax rates than we do. So the thought here is, when I'm defending markets, I'm not saying there can't be redistribution. I'm not saying the government can't do anything. What I'm imagining is just a system of well-defined, well-protected property rights where people can depend on each other in their economic transactions. So for instance, in lower trust countries, you go to some kind of open market, you have to haggle with people, you have fears of fraud or cheating. Whereas, in Sweden, you go to in many places in the United States, you go to the grocery store, you buy things that you assume meet safety regulations. You're not going to find, poison in your cereal box, right? You buy them from people and you assume that everything going on is relatively honest. So you need some level of trust to have markets, but positive market interactions can help with trust because you usually have no idea who the person you're interacting with is. You just assume that you can depend on them. It's also the case that, Joseph Henrich and others have found that market-based societies actually tend to be higher trust than non-market societies. And there's a number of different reasons that this may be. But one could be just this effect of being able to cooperate with people you don't know positively on a regular basis. Another reason that markets can help is that we all know, I think we all left and right can agree that say what you will about the market economy, but it brings home the bacon, right? Like it's very, very productive. Very few people want to deny that. They just say, well, like it's chaotic or it hurts people or it's unequal or exploitative. But we can all pretty much agree that it's extremely productive. And that economic growth, different governments use it in different ways. Sometimes they give it to the top, but sometimes they use it to invest in kind of broad-based growth. And in those kinds of situations, those can be really trust enhancing. One of the things I've been thinking about lately is because trust levels vary most, I think, among young people, of something like Cory Booker's idea for baby bonds. So people grow up with the sense that their society is investing in them in some way. But notice, if I recall correctly, these aren't just government assets. They would involve holding private market assets. So this is a way, for instance, that you could have people involved in markets. They would actually have investments from birth in a way that would, I think, help people out and increase trust, particularly among the young who feel like, their parents aren't robbing them blind and giving them opportunities, which is how I think many millennials feel about baby boomers. So there's a lot. So if we just try to distinguish between our rhetoric about markets and then what I'm trying to be precise about, there's lots of ways that markets can create trust, and trust can help lay the foundation for markets. And when you have lots of economic growth, there's questions about whether economic growth affects social trust. It probably doesn't very much, but social trust does look like it helps growth quite a bit. But you get more resources. You can do those to make people better off directly. You can do things like invest in more social services because you just have more resources, right? You can just do more to boost things like education or healthcare or something along those lines. So that's, I think, if people just distinguish between, I'm not talking about low taxes, I'm just talking about well-protected open markets with well-defined legal property rights.
That's great. Great. So also it is curious, given your emphasis on the kind of the institutions of liberal democracy, that some countries, perhaps China comes to mind, have been able to maintain relatively high levels of at least social trust and social cohesion without the framework of liberal democracy. Do you think there are things that we can learn from those models?
So China's an interesting case because there's a lot of trust researchers who think that that the Chinese data isn't very reliable. There's like 4 countries where trust researchers think that the people might be lying to pollsters, and China is one of them. China just has some weird outlier patterns. For instance, people tend to trust local government more than national government, but in China, the situation's reversed. And so some people think that there may be a lot of trust in that people may not trust the national government all that much, but they're afraid to say they don't. So it's not quite clear what to make of the Chinese situation. So just with that on the table. But assume it was true, what are the ways in which authoritarian countries maintain trust? Well, there's a couple of things that they can do that democratic countries can't do too well. One is that there are a lot of black markets and what are sometimes called gray markets in authoritarian countries, where people have to form their own economic networks. And there's a lot of trust building that can be built in that way with those private economic networks. But that's sort of, we don't want to just maximize trust, right? I mean, in the book I talk about we want to sustain trust based on, people being trustworthy in general and being under relatively free and well-protected and fair conditions. I have a more nuanced way of explaining that in the book. So that's one way that they produce trust, is because you've got the small cabal of people at the top, and most people are having to figure out ways to work together. Another effect that's probably going on is that there are fewer people to blame for policy failures. So there may be relatively higher trust in those environments, just because you think, well, most people don't want to live under this stuff. So you don't get hatred between Democrats and Republicans in authoritarian countries because parties aren't even allowed, right? There's no red versus blue, right, in North Korea. So that's another thing that may be going on. A third thing is that there's a lot of propaganda, and usually one media outlet. And so a lot of people may trust the government based on just propaganda and lies. Now, a lot of times they mistrust it. Maybe they say they trust it, but don't. So those are some reasons authoritarian countries may be able to do okay, but they're not in general especially more trusting. It's the long-term stable democracies that tend to be the most trusting, particularly the Scandinavian countries, which, are just off the charts.
So you mentioned propaganda, so it leads in nicely to questions that people often have about the role of media and journalism. You can't get through a talk on polarization without addressing the media, and I suspect the same is true about social trust. So what's there?
Well, as I was finishing up the book, media trust was the thing I was starting to get more knee deep in, and that I felt like I couldn't say much that was helpful about it. In part because I'm just learning about media architecture and the way that the different news media outlets, in particular cable television, are laid out. A lot of people tend to blame social media for undermining trust, but it's probably the case that cable news is the worst because it's the most echo chamber. Like on Facebook, maybe you learn that your uncle's a rabid Trump supporter or something, and you interact with them, or you learn people's politics, right? At least you have to interact, or you see some other messaging or something like that. Whereas if all you do is watch Fox, then you're not going to get that. And people make pretty fine-grained distinctions between, different channels and newspapers, back when people were reading newspapers. And the trouble is, I don't really know how to increase trust in ways that would not violate the First Amendment. So, for instance, you could, require them to lie less. I don't know how enforceable that would be, but I think it would be a violation of the First Amendment. But one thing I've been thinking about very recently, and this is kind of a strange thing, is that the media ecosystem the media ecosystem on the left has many more groups, and they're in more competition with each other. So I think it's much harder to maintain a single false narrative on the left in the left media ecosystem. And many on the right think, well, they did it anyway with Russia or whatever. But I don't think that's what was actually going on. Whereas on the right, the number of media outlets is very small, relatively speaking. And so it's easier to maintain a closed circuit. So what you'd ideally want, and again, this is just something I've been thinking about recently, is to increase the number of right-wing media outlets. Now, that may sound very strange to people, but the idea is you create a coordination problem on the right? Where it's harder to solidify, say, around the president's narrative. This is actually, and again, this will shock many of you, but I actually think maybe Trump being angry at Fox and being eager to back Newsmax may actually be good for the right-wing media ecosystem as a whole. Because now Newsmax and Fox will, maybe throw some volleys at each other. And I expect Fox will have to become a little bit more in the center. And I expect also in this, I expect it to become more accurate. In particular, because I can imagine some of the talking commentators leaving, and letting the journalists there have more sway. Another thing that was interesting, and I don't know what you'll think about this, but there's that Fox News effect on Republican polling, and I don't know, it'll be interesting to see if it shrinks after this, if there's multiple outlets. But all Trump is doing is tweeting, a One America News Network and Newsmax and all this stuff now. So I figure as long as he stays mad at Fox, that may actually be good. It may actually be a good development. So the idea is the only way I know how to not violate the First Amendment is to try to create more outlets. But now, of course, they could all have a race to the bottom as well. It just doesn't look like it works that way on the left. You have a range, and you can kind of tell which is more reliable. You know that if you go to most people know you listen to NPR, you're in better shape than if you listen to MSNBC. I think most people just kind of know that. And I think maybe in time people say, well, I could listen to Fox, but One America News or Newsmax or Breitbart, that's kind of shadier stuff. So not as hopeful as I would like to be, but that's my thinking at the moment.
Well, Trump's already lost Drudge, so there's been a start.
That was fascinating.
So you talk about the other reforms that are out there, the ones that you're not especially fond of. So as I mentioned in my intro, you're pretty critical of more radical arguments from reform, including those that come from the left, as well as those that come for the right. But you reserve a lot of your fire for kind of populist movements, both of the, of the left and the right. Why do you think that populism of either variety is so damaging to social and political trust?
Well, there's quite a bit to say on this. I mean, I'm just going to take populism as a series of movements that depend on a very strong kind of in-group, out-group dynamic, right? So right-wing populism, you see a lot of focus on, sort of the real America, right? The heartland, the people that, aren't from other places and so on like that. So right-wing populism will oftentimes distinguish between, the real Americans or the real country members, and to the exclusion of people that are more diverse. Whereas on the left, it tends to be more divided up by racial differences or differences between the 1% and the 99%. And the difficulties I see with both kinds of populism that we're seeing more of is that there's a tendency to try to embed a deep in-group, out-group distinction in the culture. To say, look, these folks are always oppressors or always cheaters or always sneaks, and these people are always good or appropriate or law-abiding or safe. And so I think populism kind of depends on driving home this tribal distinction between who's in and who's out. And the cool thing about liberalism at its best, and liberal institutions, they try harder than almost any other institutions historically to not do that, right? I mean, that's the spirit of the liberal tradition in political philosophy for the most part, is to try to say, versus other political traditions and ideologies, that look, everyone's free and equal. We have to take everybody seriously. We need to try to be neutral on issues that are matters of great controversy, like religion. And so the liberal stress on inclusivity, particularly across different viewpoints, different religious viewpoints, and now I think we should be stressing political viewpoints. I think we have to stick within the liberal policy toolkit because things aren't going to get better. But let me give you one example that I think is particularly salient. One thing that can happen when trust in government is low is there's some recent work suggesting that it may explain increases in populist voting. So people will say, look, we got to drain the swamp. They're all corrupt in Washington. They're all elite globalists or something like that, right? But then the populists come in and they don't do a better job. And oftentimes they're much worse at following basic democratic norms and so are super corrupt. And that can decrease trust in government. It can also, because of corruption, it may negatively affect even social trust. So the worry is that if you have lower political trust, you get more populism, you get more political distrust. And I actually think that happened in this country. We had falling political trust, really low in trust in government in 2015. Trump comes right along and says, yeah, I mean, it makes sense. I mean, they are untrustworthy. We have to throw them out. And then he comes in, and then lo and behold, World Value Survey says you double the number of people who say government can't be trusted at all. So there, I think the political trust populist connection is pretty close, and it's one of the things that I think is coming out right now more clearly in data. But the big problem is trying to culturally embed an in-group, out-group distinction. That can't be erased or overcome.
Great. So, U.S. right now facing several crises, crises of trust, and all of which clearly map onto political divisions. First, we have Black Lives Matter and concerns about police behavior and brutality. We have sharp divisions over the public health measures related to COVID, and we have massive levels of mistrust associated with the 2020 election. How optimistic are you that your prescriptions, if taken seriously, can make a dent in any of these kind of concrete problems?
Before 2020, when I finished the book, before this year, I was actually a lot more confident. I thought, one thing that could happen is if we had a catastrophe of some kind, people would surely come together. That's why I think the trust levels are so much higher going back in time, because I think there's a World War II effect where a lot of younger people said, look, and as they said in Britain, everyone did their bit, right? So everyone's working towards the defeat, but it's an external enemy. So most people were trusting each other more. So at the beginning of COVID, I thought, okay, surely the president will get a little bit more serious and people will kind of come together and realize that, protecting the elderly and things like that were really, really important. So I thought, this will be more like World War II and less like Vietnam. But that was wrong. So now I'm afraid. I'm afraid particularly of these people who are being reported to be dying in hospitals, that are dying of COVID, that are unable to believe that they have COVID. And the hope is that we can continue to find ways of sort of toggling or changing trust attitudes that don't set off people's partisan alarm bells. So for me, that's the search algorithm for policy, right? Are these policies likely to affect trust, and can they be sold to the public in a bipartisan way? And the more effort that we can put into that kind of thinking, the better off we'll be. So let me just to speak to the Black Lives Matter question that I think is important is that, because we're able through modern media to draw more attention to police, to bad behavior among police, creates a new potential source of distrust in the police. But there are a couple of things I think that can be done to increase trust in police, and two things that don't often go together in our discussions. Number one, increase the number of police and their funding. So a lot of people in poor minority communities, they don't want the police to go away. They just don't want them to use terrible tactics. So they actually would prefer more police on the street. And when you have more police, I think there is a reduced crime effect. But you also want reforms, for instance, bans on the carotid, holds and all those carotid holds, and things like that. And I think there's legislation out there to do that. But if you were to say, look, let's have police reform. We're going to fund them more. We're going to have more police. We're going to ban some procedures. We're going to have cameras. Maybe people on the right would say, okay, I'm not getting this is hopeful, but people would say, okay, I'm not going to oppose this fiercely because there's some good stuff in there. So maybe that's too optimistic in 2020. But I do think there are a lot of people that are worried about these tactics, and I think that they can be reformed. And if you aren't talking about defunding the police, it doesn't freak everybody out. You say refund the police, right? Expand funding for the police, but also restrict these tactics. I think that could actually help with trust a great deal. You'd have less crime, so people would be less uncomfortable in various ways or less suspicious, and they'd be able to trust the police more because they wouldn't be using these tactics that are seen so out of bounds.
I would say one of the things that connect these three things together is the role of elite actors in kind of stoking distrust for political reasons. Are there ways that we can think about disincentivizing political leaders from using these tactics beyond voting them out of office, which is a fairly crude instrument given that we only get to do it once every 4 years?
Yeah, I mean, the problem is that the Constitution locks a lot of this stuff in so much that it's difficult to suggest changes that would be perfectly feasible in other countries where a Constitution could be more easily changed. But one thing that I would think would help, and I'm sure you have views about this, is something more like a parliamentary voting system where you could have a greater than two-party equilibrium. So it wouldn't be red versus blue anymore, right? It'd be red, blue, yellow, green. Who knows what the ultimate equilibrium would be. The problem is the parties aren't going to allow those kind of reforms. But most democracies are closer to parliamentary democracies than our presidential democracy. So I think things that could disrupt the sort of sense that there's two parties and they're opposed in every way, I think that would help. I also, though, and I know you have worries about ranked choice voting, but I like to think that ranked choice voting could also be depolarizing in the sense and trust building, because people would have to think, okay, it's not just the one I like and the one I hate, right? Like there's people in between. And, oh, wait, if I put the Green Party second between the Democrats and the Republicans, we might end up with the Green Party president. So I better be careful. Maybe my first choice is Republican and my second choice is Democrat. And maybe they're not so bad, maybe that's too optimistic. And maybe there are other problems, with ranked choice voting. Most people, I think, just don't.
The problem with ranked choice voting is that people don't rank more than one candidate. So it's not.
Yeah. Like in Australia, they vote above the line is what they call it, right? Yeah. Right. So, there's different things that might help, but I do think there are different ways of organizing democracy. But let me suggest one more thing that may surprise viewers. I think we shouldn't have as many. I think you agree with this. We shouldn't have open primaries where we should let the parties decide on who to nominate for elections. Almost all democracies do it this way, as I understand. And yeah, it's backroom dealing, but will people decide these things? And that's seen on the one hand as corrupt. But on the other hand, I think it tends to produce more moderate candidates and also more effective candidates that can actually govern effectively. So I think, a reduction of democratic inputs in the primary system. I'm not saying I'm opposed to democracy. I mean, Britain's a democracy, right? I mean, it's, just because you don't have democratic primaries doesn't mean you don't have a democracy. So I think that could actually help quite a bit. I mean, if the Republican Party had operated in this way, Trump would never have been nominated. And one point you make in your book is the Republican Party is actually a pretty weak party in the sense that it can't keep itself from being controlled by special interests and political outsiders in various ways. But I think it would be a much more healthy party if it could. And one of the ways of doing that is not having these, wild open primaries that the media are obsessed with.
Okay. I think we now probably have some time to open up to questions from the audience.
Hi, everybody. There we go. A little bit of a delay there in coming back on. Sorry about that. Wow, this has been a really fascinating discussion. I'm going to just open up the chat so people can chat as well. And people are going to put their questions in the chat, or you can put your questions in the question and answer box. I can catch them from both places at this point. So the top question, it's a little bit detailed here, so let's see if we can get it out. And it talks about Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments. Can Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments speak to this problem? He suggests that we can have a limited government and institutions of a free society, including markets, without personal virtue and self-governance. You've talked about policy and what governments and institutions can do, but what can be done at the individual level?
All right, so two good questions there. I talked about the theory of moral sentiments in some more detail, but a lot of the key idea there is that people really do have moral motivations. They're not just self-interested. Smith never thought that they were purely self-interested, but that people had a capacity for sympathy, to be able to take each other's perspectives. And one of the things that happens when trust declines, I think, is it's harder to that faculty for sympathy to be applied very broadly across your society as a whole, which is already hard enough as it is, because it tends to stick close to home to people that you know. So that's sort of one issue with Smith, is the relationship between trust and our capacity to even take the impartial spectator's point of view, right? Because, we don't want to be impartial with these people who are bad, right? Who are on the other team. As far as the question of more limited government, I think it's complex. I mean, I think there are some ways in which government should be more limited, some ways in which it should be able to expand in some respects. And, that's something I've come to in my own, research of, kind of starting off earlier on as a kind of more limited government guy. I think there's good arguments for those kinds of institutions, but the situation we're in, if we really care about rebuilding trust, we're not going to be able to go in with just a set ideology that's going to spit out everything. In fact, being ideological is probably trust destroying in various respects. As far as what we can do at home, as far as social trust goes, I just don't know. I mean, besides be a good person, which isn't very helpful. The truth is we need more research and understanding where social trust came from, and about really how Homo sapiens ever became capable of it in the first place. There's some interesting new work by Joe Henrich on how we might have developed societies that have high social trust, where effectively what was going on in Europe is that the Catholic Church is starting to ban things like cousin marriage. Family units became smaller, and probably in those societies, they tended to do better if they could trust people they didn't know, and develop more formal institutions that would allow them to trust each other rather than their clan. But I don't know. I wish I could tell you, but it's something I want to spend a lot of time on in the future, researching and working with social scientists on. Do
you have any thoughts on that, Nolan?
No, I think it's hard to build trust. Just to take one example, you can tell your kids that they need to be trusting. And the first time they go to school and somebody steals their lunchbox, from a kid who didn't get that lesson from their parents, it's gone. I mean, it is nice to think that, there's stuff that individuals can do as individuals, but trust is intrinsically a social phenomenon.
That's right.
And you need it to be adopted widely from society to reinforce the individual behaviors. In absence, being able to switch it on for large segments of the population is very, very hard to restore.
It's a coordination problem. People have to be more trustworthy. And the problem is that, if you trust people less, I mean, you're less likely to play by the rules, right? So why be a sucker, And so, you can get a sort of distrust, untrustworthiness cycle. It's very hard to extricate yourself from.
Yeah. I think that's exactly what we are in. And this is a question about, for both of you, about radicalization, and I guess both on the left and the right. And how is the radicalization, and I guess, related to this polarization? And what role does that have to play?
Yeah, I mean, Nolan will have views on this with respect to polarization, but there's some very recent research that I talk about in the introduction, Trust in a Polarized Age, where I do think it does seem like lower trusters tend to be more conspiratorial and have more extreme political opinions. We're not, there hasn't been enough data or time to really tease apart in a serious way the causal relationships. Is it the case that some people are just low trust and then they tend to be more extreme? Well, there's lots of low trust people in countries that aren't very polarized. So I think there's some kind of interaction. And one thing that might be going on, and this is what the authors of the study suggested, is that people are more likely to moderate their preferences when they're more trusting. And that might be because they're more likely to listen to other people. Right? Like if you're pretty knee deep into QAnon, you're not really trusting other people. You think they're either evil or most of them are just dupes and sheep, right? So there's some kind of relationship between being low trust and being more conspiratorial and further from centrist opinions. But teasing out the causality is difficult.
Yeah. On the distinction between polarization and radicalization, I'm not sure there's kind of a hard, sharp division between the two. But you can imagine, a polarization within limits of a kind of a constitutional order where people just adopt diverse and heterogeneous preferences and pursue heterogeneous goals, for which polarization in and of itself is not particularly problematic. Makes it a little bit harder to reach a consensus, but it's not really a threat to the system.
Right.
Radicalization, I guess you might say, would be when polarization goes beyond those bounds, and people decide that in order to pursue their political goals or their dominance of their identities over the outgroups, they need to change the rules surreptitiously and push boundaries, break constitutional norms, and either advocate for radical reform or actually change things radically without any sort of broader social consensus. I think the United States has gone beyond the simple polarization of principled disagreements among partisans. It's clear that I don't want to play both sides, especially clear on the right. There's been much more of a push to bend and push norms in order to be victorious at all costs. But I don't think it's gone so far that it can't be reined back in. We did have an election. We have a new president who seems committed both formally to those old norms and dispositionally to those norms. So I'm hoping that we can move back from the frontier of kind of radicalization back to just normal, good old-fashioned polarization disagreements. Situations that can be handled by just enhancing social and political trust. The worry about radicalization is that perhaps you can bend the institution so far that there's no infrastructure to kind of bring the parties back together on a level playing field so that they can actually reach broad consensus agreements about public policy anymore.
Yeah. Here's again another longer kind of both a comment and a question buried within it from Mike Tolhurst. He's got his name here, and he says he's going to challenge Kevin a little bit on populism. When you look at the language of some populists, such as on the left, there is an emphasis on solidarity and breaking down barriers between groups. Indeed, they may argue that so long as we get all the people working together, we can solve problems. Assuming that these populists are sincere in their aspirations, why are they not reducing polarization? And then he puts in brackets that I think you are right, but I'm not sure that this would satisfy a populist interlocutor.
Yeah, so I think it depends on to some extent the time period of populists that you're looking at, because a lot of the main parties were talking about things like the common good and people coming together and trying to narrow economic inequalities, that were have been sort of common within ordinary liberal democratic politics. But so I don't want to make this a definitional truth, but the unique thing to me about populism, as we see it today, is that the varieties that we see do seem really committed to, as I said, embedding that in group out group distinction. So, and Nolan may disagree with this, but one of the things that we see, for instance, on a lot of the populist left, with a lot of the language about certain differences between, races or forms of racial oppression being unsolvable or things that we can't really do anything about. So I think, and some of that language is more common on the left, but it's kind of, it's not something I think actually Bernie Sanders actually thinks. So maybe if you identify left-wing populism with Bernie Sanders, it's a little bit different. But if you look at someone more like, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, then I do think you see more of this kind of, sense of there's oppressors and the oppressed, and that's just kind of how things are. They have to be defeated. One interesting thing about this to me is actually, I think the left has changed a lot in its general attitude about reconciliation over the last 30 or 40 years. I mean, you used to hear about peace and reconciliation from the left way more than you heard from the right, 40, 50 years ago. This was kind of the hippies being peaceniks and all this kind of stuff. So I think the rhetoric on the left has really changed in that regard.
Yeah. The other thing I would add, there's an ingredient in populism, not unrelated to the ones Kevin mentioned, but there's an agreement of delegitimizing delegitimizing opposing viewpoints. I think it's worse on the right than the left. I don't want to play both sides, but there's an element of kind of left-wing populism, not just in the U.S., but Latin America, and other places, in which disagreements are delegitimized, that people who argue against the agenda of these movements are somehow, enemies of the people, or their views are illegitimate, capitalist running dogs, whatever kind of flowery language you want to use. So I said the key distinction is really about delegitimizing kind of opposition to viewpoints. Liberalism, for all its flaws, one of the things that it tries to flourish in is that, we are a system for reconciling competing disagreements. And we take those disagreements as given and we try to reconcile them. I'd say both flavors of populism are to say, let's not try to reconcile disagreements. Let's try to defeat the opposition and delegitimize their viewpoints.
Jenny, I think you're muted.
I am muted because my dog was barking upstairs, and I was afraid it was going to carry down. So I just want to say that I think we're going to wrap up this hour at that note, because that was a good way to end, and we are coming up on 8 o'clock. So I want to thank everybody for tuning in. I want to thank both professors for joining us here tonight to lead this discussion. This will be going up on the library's YouTube channel. And it will also be live here on Crowdcast within about 5 minutes of me closing this down. Crowdcast puts them up for replay. So if you have friends or colleagues who you think would have enjoyed this discussion tonight but couldn't be here, you can pass the link on. We have some great comments here thanking you for the discussion, that it was very helpful, and I agree. Your book, Kevin, is very timely, I do feel, and best of luck with promoting it. And I know it just came out, and that's great. And so are you both working on, the final question will just be, are you have other projects in the works right now? New books coming out soon, or?
I'm working on a book on how polarization's affected the constitutional structure of the U.S., but it's a long way from coming out.
Okay, that sounds interesting. Well, keep us in mind. Maybe by the time it comes out, we'll be back to doing in-person events, and you can just stroll down the street to the library and do it in our community room. That would be lovely. Yeah. Or maybe we can do it at Labyrinth. Labyrinth Books, that sounds like another good location for you to do this.
Yeah.
And what about you, Kevin?
Well, I guess this is one of the first places I'll announce it, but OUP has gotten me interested in writing a critique of some of the thought on the new right. In particular, I'll be tackling some of the theological right-wing positions, particularly the new Catholic integralism, which is so popular on Twitter, if you're there. But, a variety of, I'm going to call it illiberal perfectionism. So looking at non-liberal doctrines, taking them very seriously in and of themselves. Those that say the state should be built around a good, and that good is not freedom. So that's, that's going to be the kind of views that I'm going to be addressing. But it's mostly going to be a kind of internal critique of those positions, but trying to take them seriously on their own terms.
Oh, that sounds really interesting as well. Someone suggesting that we should develop social trust over pancakes at PJ's. And Jessica is on here, who's your publicist. She's agreeing that that's a good plan. You're not from Princeton, but yes, pancakes at PJ's is always a good idea, and it's a good way to bridge divides. So thank you again for being here tonight, and best wishes. And this is always the awkward part of these virtual events, is closing them down, because I'm going to hit the end broadcast button and we're going to just disappear. But again, this has been great, and we will connect with people again in other spaces at other times. Okay, goodbye, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.